John Davenport was not always lonely. Once upon a time, he was the man everyone wanted to be: young, handsome, brilliant, and rich. The world called him a genius of finance, the man who could turn dust into gold. But behind his billions, there was silence, the kind that followed tragedy. 5 years before he met Margaret, his wife, Elena, had died in a car accident on a rainy night. She was pregnant with their first child. John had been on a business trip in Tokyo when the call came. He remembered falling to the floor in the hotel room, his phone slipping from his hand, his chest tightening like a fist. The world never sounded the same after that. He had built his empire higher, richer, louder, but inside, he was hollow. His smile was mechanical, his eyes distant. He bought companies, not happiness. He signed contracts, not connections. People called him the cold billionaire. They said he had no heart. Perhaps, in some ways, they were right. Margaret Hale was 32. She worked as a nurse in a small hospice near the edge of the city. Her world was quiet, a routine of fading lights, patient sighs, and the soft beeping of machines. She wasn't beautiful in a dazzling way, but she had a kind of calm grace that made people trust her. Her eyes were gentle, though sometimes clouded with something she tried to hide, a private sadness. Her father had died when she was a teenager, and her mother, who had struggled with illness for years, passed away not long after. Life had taught Margaret not to hope too much. Hope, she learned, could be cruel. But she was kind, deeply kind, the kind of person who held a dying man's hand long after his breathing stopped, just so he wouldn't leave the world alone. They met one cold afternoon in December. John had come to the hospice to visit one of his former employees, an old accountant named Mr. Gray. The doctors said Mr. Gray didn't have long. John rarely visited anyone, but Mr. Gray had once helped him through his early business days, back when he still smiled easily. When John entered the hospice, everything felt foreign. The air was thick with disinfectant, the walls painted in faded cream. And yet, amidst that stillness, he noticed her, Margaret, sitting beside a patient's bed, reading softly from a book of poems. Her voice was low, steady, and beautiful in its simplicity. It wasn't a song, yet it sounded like one. When she looked up and met his eyes, something shifted, a tiny spark in the dust. "Mr. Davenport," she asked gently, "you're here to see Mr. Gray?" He nodded. "Yes." "Is he still with us?" she said, her tone carrying both compassion and truth. "But you should hurry." She led him to the room. When he entered, Mr. Gray smiled faintly. "John," the old man whispered, "you came." They talked softly. John tried not to show his grief, but Margaret could feel it, a heaviness that hung around him like mist. When Mr. Gray passed away later that night, John stayed longer than most. Margaret found him standing by the window, his hands in his pockets, his eyes lost in the dark beyond the glass. "You don't have to stay," she told him gently. He replied, without turning, "I don't know where else to go." That was the first time she saw the pain behind the billionaire's mask. A week later, John returned. He said he came to donate money to the hospice, but Margaret knew it was more than that. He came because, somehow, the place, and she, had quieted something in him. They spoke often, small conversations at first, about books, about the weather, about the meaning of kindness. John wasn't used to being seen as anything but a billionaire, yet Margaret talked to him like he was simply a man. No cameras, no expectations. One evening, as the winter sun fell like a dying ember, John asked, "Why do you stay here, Margaret? You could work in a better hospital, make more money." She smiled faintly. "Because people here need me, and because sometimes, it's the quietest lives that teach us the loudest lessons." Her words stayed with him. Over the next few months, John kept visiting, sometimes to check on the hospice's renovations which he funded, and sometimes without any reason at all. He found comfort in Margaret's steadiness, the way she moved through pain without bitterness. She, in turn, saw through his armor, the loneliness he tried to bury beneath wealth. They never spoke of love, but something grew between them, slow, delicate, like the first light of dawn through fog. One evening, they shared a cup of coffee in the small hospice garden. The roses were dying from the frost, and Margaret was wrapping her scarf tighter around her neck. "Do you ever miss her?" she asked softly, knowing about his late wife. John's voice broke slightly. "Every day, some mornings, I still reach for her hand in bed." Margaret didn't reply. She simply placed her hand over his, an instinct more than a decision. He didn't pull away. That small act, that simple embrace, became the first bridge between two broken worlds. Spring came. The world outside began to bloom, but inside John's heart, something deeper stirred, a longing he couldn't name. He started to imagine what life would be like if he didn't have to return to his empty mansion each night. One afternoon, he found Margaret reading in the hospice garden. He sat beside her, nervous in a way he hadn't been in years. "Margaret," he said, his voice lower than usual, "I have a question. It might sound strange." She looked up, waiting. "Would you marry me?" The silence that followed was heavy. Her eyes widened, not out of joy, but confusion. "John, you don't mean that." "I do," he insisted softly. "I thought about it for weeks. I don't want to live the rest of my life alone." "You make the silence bearable." Tears filled her eyes. "You don't love me, John. You love what I remind you of, peace, not passion. You're lonely, that's all." "Maybe," he admitted, "but loneliness is honest, and so is what I feel when I'm with you." She looked at him for a long time, the billionaire who could have anything, asking for something money couldn't buy. And though her heart trembled, she said yes. Their wedding was small, no reporters, no lavish celebrations, just a few witnesses, a quiet garden, and a soft drizzle that felt like blessing and sorrow mixed together. Margaret wore a simple white dress. John wore a black suit, his tie undone by the wind. When he looked at her, something fragile flickered in his eyes, the first real warmth in years. They exchanged vows under an oak tree. No promises of forever, no grand declarations, just two broken hearts agreeing to hold each other through the silence. When the ceremony ended, Margaret whispered, "This doesn't feel real." John smiled faintly. Maybe real things don't always feel that way. They moved into his mansion on the hill. It was vast and beautiful, chandeliers, marble floors, and rooms that seemed too big for breathing. But Margaret often felt out of place. Her life had been one of small spaces, quiet meals, and whispered prayers. This was a palace built for ghosts. John tried to make her feel at home. He gave her a room of her own, a garden, and freedom to do whatever she wished. But what she wanted most was something he struggled to give, warmth. He was kind, but distant, loving, but restrained. Some nights, she would find him sitting alone in his study, staring at the picture of Elena. She never complained. Instead, she learned to live beside his grief, like a shadow beside another shadow. Despite the silence, small moments began to grow between them. Breakfast shared without words. Walks in the garden where he would pick the first rose of spring and hand it to her. Once, when she fell ill with fever, he stayed by her bedside all night, feeding her soup and whispering stories from his childhood. When she woke up, she found his head resting on the edge of the bed, his hands still holding hers. That morning, something changed, not loudly, but deeply. For the first time, she saw him not as a billionaire or a broken man, but as someone capable of quiet tenderness. A year into their marriage, Margaret found an old letter in John's drawer, one he had written to Elena but never sent. It spoke of regret, of guilt, of wishing he could trade all his wealth just to hear her laugh again. Margaret read it with tears streaming down her face. That night, she didn't confront him. Instead, she went to the garden and cried quietly under the oak tree where they had married. When John found her there, he knelt beside her, his own eyes glistening. "You read it?" he said simply. "Yes," she whispered, "and I understand." He shook his head. "You shouldn't have to. You deserve more than the half of me that's left." She turned to him, voice trembling. "John, love isn't always about having all of someone. Sometimes it's about embracing what remains." That night, they held each other like two souls finally allowed to grieve together. 2 years later, Margaret was diagnosed with a rare heart condition. It was quiet at first, dizziness, fatigue, shortness of breath. But soon, it worsened. Doctors said she needed surgery, but the risks were high. When John heard the news, he broke for the first time since Elena's death. He smashed a glass against the wall and sank to the floor, his hands trembling. "Not again," he whispered. "I can't lose her too." Margaret tried to be strong. "John, I've lived more in these 2 years with you than in all the years before. Don't be afraid." But he was. Terribly. He hired the best doctors, flew in specialists, and refused to leave her side. The billionaire who once commanded the world now found himself powerless against fate. The night before her surgery, Margaret asked him to sit beside her. "Do you regret marrying me?" she asked softly. He looked at her, his eyes red. "Never. You brought me back to life." She smiled faintly. "Then promise me something. If I don't make it, don't let the house become a grave again. Open the windows. Plant more roses. Live." He held her hand tightly. "Don't talk like that." But she continued, "John, love isn't about forever. It's about the embrace we give before the light fades." He kissed her forehead, tears falling onto her skin. That night, he didn't sleep. He just watched her, memorizing the rhythm of her breathing, the fragile proof that love still existed in the world. She didn't survive the surgery. The doctors came out with quiet eyes and heavy steps. John stood frozen as the words echoed through him. It felt like the world had stopped, again. The next days were a blur, the funeral, the condolences, the silence. He sat in the garden, staring at the roses she loved. It rained that afternoon, just like on their wedding day. He whispered, "You promised me peace, and you gave it. You promised me love, and you left it behind." Years passed. John never remarried. He turned part of his mansion into a hospice, in her name. The Margaret Davenport Home of Grace. He visited it every week, talking to the patients, reading to them just as she once had. People said he had changed, that the cold billionaire had become a man of compassion. One afternoon, as he walked through the garden of the hospice, he saw a nurse reading poetry to a patient, the same way Margaret once did. He closed his eyes, smiled faintly, and felt her presence in the wind. Love, he realized, never really leaves. It just changes form, from embrace to memory, from sorrow to grace. On the 10th anniversary of her death, John visited her grave under the oak tree. He brought a single rose, the first bloom of the season. Kneeling, he whispered, "Do you know, Margaret, the world still calls me the billionaire. But you and I, we were just two people trying to hold each other through the pain." The wind rustled the leaves, soft and warm. He closed his eyes and smiled, and for a brief, eternal moment, he felt it, her arms around him, her voice whispering through the air. "I told you, love is the power of an embrace."